One thing I think we need to remember, too, about China, just in terms of timing of this phone call with Zelensky and territorial ambition, is that at the outset of the Ukraine war, just days before China had had this conversation with Russia about the so-called no-limits partnership, and then Russia invades, and then U.S. intelligence officials inform everybody that Xi Jinping, according to their intelligence, was actually caught off guard by that. And so I think we see this balancing act from Xi Jinping and from China about territorial ambition, particularly as we consider what China is going to do about Taiwan or not do about Taiwan. And so I think we see this balancing act from China here. And I think as far as the reaction in Europe goes, we've seen many foreign ministers come out and say, this is exactly why we don't think China should be trying to broker a peace here in Ukraine. But we see that these relationships continuing to mold even to this day. And
what irked Shannon, the Ukrainians, was the Chinese named a diplomat who would be in charge of brokering, but it wasn't somebody from their Europe bureau, it was somebody from their Eurasia bureau.
Yes, I believe it was someone who's a former, and correct me if I'm wrong, a former ambassador to Russia, which is a very interesting choice. And I think, and I'm curious what the rest of the panel thinks today on this, the conversation that Zelensky had about their phone call afterwards was, we need to lean on China here and take advantage of the leverage they have and the power they have. And I'm curious where everyone thinks that relationship is going to.
Ulrike Koltermannof, China was Ukraine's #1 trading partner before the fighting began in February 2021.
Yeah, and I think there are several leaders who think that if there's one country who has an influence on Russia, then it's China. And Macron was pushing for it, and the Germans are also pushing China into that direction. They don't really want them to be the mediator, but still use its influence. But on the same hand, they are very skeptical that it will happen, because China will always keep its close ties to Russia, and they try to be neutral, and they're not using any influence. I mean,
will always keep its close ties to Russia. You just heard Robert Parsons say they're close, but they're also happy to sap Russia's power.
Yes, but they're still dependent, and they still need their energy, and they still need them as a trade partner. So I think they will not meddle. And what the only thing that when Scholz went and they were asking and trying and pushing them into the direction to be more active in Ukraine, and the only thing what they said is, so please don't use nuclear weapons, and that was so. Nothing really that came out, but they're not going to do more than that, I think.
Yeah, I think China is very happy to buy discounted Russian oil.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's been Russia, along with India, China's become the big buyer of Russian oil since the war in Ukraine began, and obviously that gives China a lot of leverage over Russia, but that may not be a situation that really they're inclined to change, and also given the fact that China, just like Russia, is in a big fight with the United States. And so it's not just Europe that's in play here. It's the United States, both countries' relationship with the United States.
And they are competing in Africa as well. I mean, both are very, very active and investing. And Russia has a Wagner mercenaries in several countries. China is for years investing. So there's also another playing field where they are competing.
You mentioned the German Chancellor. He's a social democrat. I don't know if you've seen Ulrike Koltermannof, but the Western press has been gushing ever since her visit to Beijing. The German foreign minister, she's a green because of her straight talk when it comes to Beijing. What is Germany's policy?
The thing is, we have a coalition, and so sometimes there are several parts of this coalition that are not really talking the same language.
Robert Parsons, right now, the role of China, since Macron's trip, picking up on the point made earlier by Ulrike, the role of China in Ukraine, how is it evolving?
Well, look, the Chinese are trying to position themselves so that they can play perhaps a similar role to the one they played in the relationship, the talks between Saudi Arabia and Iran. They see themselves as one of the major powers in the world now, that they want to be in a position to take a key leading role, as the United States has always done up until now, in settling these sort of disputes. And that's why the Chinese are presenting themselves now as neutral, although many people in the West would not regard them as neutral at all. That's why they keep repeating this. You know, we are neutral. We're not going to pour alcohol, whatever the expression was, petrol onto the fire.
But they're using Russia's talking points when they describe. They called it the readout of the phone call between Zelensky and Xi called it the crisis in Ukraine. Didn't mention Russia's invasion.
Exactly. Nobody's very convinced at this stage. And the 12-point plan that they put forward was regarded by the Ukrainians and by supporters of Ukraine as a complete non-starter.
They weren't even consulted.
Yeah, they weren't even consulted. Yeah. But it's important for the Ukrainians to keep the Chinese on side. You know, they recognize that if anybody can influence Moscow, it is Beijing. And it's very important for them.
And just one final point on that, Shannon, Vavra, because the National Security Council spokesperson at the White House after that phone call called it, quote, a good thing. Explain, with the enmity these days between Beijing and Washington, can you explain a little?
You know, I think when we look at the relationship between U.S. and China, one thing to remember, too, is that U.S. officials, when they talk about China's relationship to a potential conflict with Taiwan, they say conflict is not inevitable. And so I think seeing this conversation where China's interested in potentially brokering peace or a ceasefire, or I think what they're calling a political settlement, might look like good news to Washington. And I think it's also important we remember when it comes to the Chinese perspective, historically, it's all about winning wars without actually fighting them. And so I wonder if it's this focus on increased diplomacy that might be a good sign.